Everybody. This is Professor Robin Russo, and I am one of the course designers here for English 121 Intro to Journalism. So right now, I'm going to take you through our first module lecture. You're going to need this for the module quiz, so make sure that you have viewed this. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you and take you through this video lecture here. So today, we're going to be covering some of the most important basics that you're going to need for English 121. The 5 W's and an H to objectivity to inverted pyramids. So as I noted, make sure that you have read all of the assigned chapters that are in the course, as well as watch this video, because you'll need both for the quiz in this module. Also, this information is just really important grounding information that you'll need for the whole semester. So what is news? As opposed to just telling you only my opinion of news, I've brought in a few experts. This one comes from the Pulitzer Center. You might know the name Pulitzer from things like the Pulitzer Prize.
Hi, I'm Natalie Applewhite from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. We've been thinking a lot about how the public understands what news is, and we want to know what you think. I mean, what actually makes news news? I asked a few journalists what they thought.
So what is news? Well, I think that anything that's interesting is news.
One of my kids, when she was real young, said, "Dad, I like the kind of news that tells you what's happening." And I think in the most basic sense, we're out there on the front lines telling people what's happening.
I think with the advent of the web, what we've seen is a diminishment and emphasis on news as news, and a rearrangement in people's mind about what news is. It's with this kind of equipment, with the web, with everything else, it's now all about me.
I think it's very important to realize that without professionals reporting the news, people who are not advertisers or even community people who might, have a spin or might want to make somebody look good, then the product that you get is no longer news.
I think news is what people want to know and what people need to know. And they don't always appear to be the same thing. And I think that that's when it's our job to make the connection clear.
I think that the news media has a way of actually changing the definition of what news is, because as we report more, we know more about each other, and we become more interested in other parts of the world.
Some see the central purpose of journalism as being to give citizens the information they need to function in a democratic society. That the news media should be a watchdog of those in power, and that its job is to expose deceit and let truth emerge. Many people believe that news as information is a public good. In the US, broadcasters are even mandated to serve the public interest. But what is the public interest? Mark Fowler, former head of the Federal Communications Commission, says that what's in the public interest is what the public is interested in, which of course raises a funny question. I mean, how do I know if I'm interested in something if I don't know about it in the first place? If we let the news be determined by what will bring in the most advertising dollars, is it still news? I mean, what is the real purpose of news? So what do you think? The Pulitzer Center would like to know. Please send this.
So hopefully that brings you guys a lot of interesting questions as you're beginning your journalism journey. We have another view here on what news is. This one comes from the BBC. So it's going to be giving you a somewhat different view than perhaps you might have seen from that last one, which were all American journalists, but I still think it has some important ideas as to what news can be.
Since the beginning of civilization, people have found creative ways to share information using the tools available to them at the time. Why? Because information gives you knowledge, and knowledge empowers us to make better decisions, be aware of dangers and opportunities, and learn new ways of being safer, happier, and smarter. Today, technology gives us real-time access to stories happening everywhere, from our own neighborhoods to right across the globe, connecting us to our communities and to the rest of the world.
International dismay as the Amazon rainforest burns.
As we've been hearing,
But this technology comes at a price. Everywhere we look, someone is trying to capture our attention with the latest headline, celebrity gossip, or ad campaign. It can feel overwhelming. How do you know what to read, what to ignore, or who to believe? Hi, I'm Radzi, and I'll be your guide as we explore the world of news to find out how stories become headlines, the role of journalists, and the different ways that issues are reported, all with the aim of helping you and I become smarter consumers of all the information that's out there. With all this talk of fake news, we'll take a look at why it's so important to have real and trustworthy news sources. But first, what is news? The dictionary defines news as information about a recent event or recently changed situation. But what's the point? The news has a variety of purposes. It can be the things that inform us, interest us, or even prepare us. And you can find it in newspapers, on the radio,
it's 6 o'clock.
TV, online, and increasingly on social media. Well, the whole point of news is to provide citizens with the information they need to make decisions about their lives, their communities, their societies, their governments. The news wouldn't be possible without journalism, which is the activity of gathering, assessing, creating and presenting news information. And it's carried out by journalists in places like this, on television networks, on radio stations, to help us all understand the world around us.
So again, just an introduction right there, 2 ideas that have us thinking a lot about some of the important things that we're going to be doing and our place in this very confusing and very saturated journalism landscape that we have today. So, from looking at these 2 clips, and they are available on the presentation if you want to watch them more further, you can see that there's a lot of possible definitions. But at the broadest point, journalists define a news as story which has relevance, usefulness, and interest to their audience. Chapter 5 of your reading also expands this, saying news should have immediacy or timeliness, proximity, currency, prominence, impact, novelty, and conflict. Let's take a look at what a few of those terms mean. Impact means that the people may be affected by the event, idea, or issue. So the greater that impact is, the more newsworthy the story. And sometimes impact can be hard to determine, as information that's seemingly dull, reports that come out of things like school board meetings, can have a long-reaching impact. I've highlighted this line. A journalist's job is to think carefully about how any event could impact their readers' daily lives, whether now or in the long term. I give this example right here of something that happened to me. So when I was working at a local newspaper, I got a lot of press releases. That's very common. People are trying to get you to report on their information. And this one was about a pharmaceutical company raising the prices on contraceptives. It came from a lobbying group that was working on drug prices. I thought it looked dull, but then I realized how much it would impact local public health facilities, particularly because the areas I were covering included several economically downtrodden TODs where a lot of people used public health services. So when I called the nurses and staff at the facilities, I learned that impact was great. People had heard about this. They were very, very worried. This was a contraceptive drug that they were using all the time. And they were worried about both unplanned pregnancies or about their clients not being able to afford their medical care. So that's an example of what impact could potentially be. Conflict, as we know, you probably see this on if you've taken any literature classes as well. It's always an important point in good stories, on TV, films, novels. So conflict between people is also something that often affects whether it's newsworthy. Novelty works because we all enjoy and we're all fascinated by things that are new or bizarre. There's even an old journalist joke, dog bites man isn't news, but man bites dog is. That's to say something may be newsworthy simply because it goes against our expectations. Think about things like news of the strange or news of the weird columns. Like you'll see those in a lot of newspapers. You'll see that on a lot of typical morning broadcasts that they'll save something for just something that's bizarre or funny. Proximity. Proximity has to do with the distance. So a series of break-ins happening 3 states away if you're working for a local paper probably doesn't matter. But if you see all of a sudden in 3 streets in a row that there's break-ins and you're working for a newspaper, people are going to care a lot. You might even notice that large newspapers, our largest one right here, the Washington Post, for instance, does this, will have hyper-local sections. The New York Times, it's based in New York, but it has sections in San Francisco and Texas because they were looking and saying, oh, a lot of people are reading our paper in those areas still. So let's make sure that we're reporting on them. Prominence means how important are the people or the groups involved. So think about this. If a private citizen has an affair, that's generally not news. You do not normally see any time that Mr. X cheats on Mrs. X thrown in the news. But as soon as a politician does, it almost always becomes that. That's because whenever we look to politicians, they are often selling themselves based on their trustworthiness of their values. So a journalist has to be careful not to sensationalize stories because they're about prominent people. But you might find that something that would be ignored in a private citizen and somebody who's a public figure is going to get that. Timeliness means that something must be new to be newsworthy. With the way the internet works, especially in the age of smartphones and all of the attendant apps, news must be timely. Journalists have to be careful to report this, though, without making errors. This can be one of the hardest things now with how fast news comes. I give an example that is now over 20 years old, but something I remember because I was a student journalist at the time. On September 11th, 2001, there were a couple of erroneous reports about the White House or the Capitol also being on fire or being attacked. It's understandable given the fact that that day was very horrific, but it's one of those cases where in trying to give the news as quickly as possible, it actually created more fear. And so you've always got to balance those two. So I have a question for you guys to consider about what news is. So this is something that I faced in myself as a journalist. So Baden, Pennsylvania, it's a small former steel mill town, so a somewhat economically depressed town. It's about 7,000 people west of Pittsburgh. And a sophomore high school student just won the county science fair for her project. The project investigated the number of adults who washed their hands after using the bathroom and found really low rates, 63% of women and just 18% of men in her experiment. The results were collected at several bathrooms in a local mall over a shopping period on Black Friday. So that's the day after Thanksgiving to prepare for Christmas. And what made the project so interesting to the judges was that this was the same mall that was home to America's largest hepatitis outbreak. The year before, 600 people had been sickened and 3 killed after eating in a Mexican restaurant in the mall. The student said she wanted to see whether the outbreak, which was eventually linked to green onions, but which officials said may have spread so far because of hygiene problems, had encouraged changes. And so the county officials are really shocked and said they're going to ramp up hand washing campaigns. So a sophomore wins county science project. Is this news? This particular story in this particular place? So do you consider that newsworthy if you're reporting for something like USA Today? Big national newspaper. What if you're reporting for the Beaver County Times, a local daily newspaper? Or you're reported for a national nightly news program for television corporation, something like ABC's Nightly News, but you cover public health. Would you report on this? So if you're looking at something that's in the national interest, probably not. It just simply isn't going to have a wide enough impact to interest a national audience. Now, maybe if she had moved on and this one a state and then a national one, then potentially. If you're reporting for the local ones, absolutely. We talked about this. The student is showing the audience a slice of their own behavior, and it's particularly important because it's a follow-up from a dangerous event. So as a note, this was actually a story that I got to choose to report on. I was covering that particular school district, and I was just going to originally write it up as a note. You know, the student this is who won the county science fair. But then when I called the student to ask her about her project, I was expecting just to write a line. And when she told me what it was, I was thought, that's kind of funny. And then you take something national like this. If you're working in healthcare, this could be considered a newsworthy story if you wanted to make it part of, say, a larger trend. If, for instance, a reporter had already talked to somebody with more prominence. You might notice this on national news stories that they might use a small event to talk about a bigger problem. So if you had been seeing a lot of reports about we need to have more hand washing, and then this happens to come across because you picked up the Beaver County Times Newswire, then that might be something you would consider. So all of this, you can see that this one event is newsworthy or not based on the thought of who your audience is. So while our choices in news are always going to differ based on our audience, there are still three basic types of stories. There's news, features, and opinion and editorial. Each of these has different qualities and can be important for different reasons. News, or sometimes referred to as hard or breaking or straight news, are the stories that are happening just before or during the moment of publication. So especially now, if you're looking at something like an online website, you will often see continual updating when something's going on. These stories focus on what journalists call the 5 W's and an H: who, what, when, where, why, and how. So I give this example of one hard news story where it was a new pope being elected. You can see that we've got all of the important information: who, when it happened, what's happening as it's coming in that moment. You've got the full story there as a link if you want to read it. Features is a story looking for more of a narrative appeal. This is the case the story is not maybe breaking news. It's not something that's happening right in the moment. We need to know who, what, where, when, why, but this is looking at more of like the hows. It might be looking at a trend, an interesting individual or group of people. A new head of state, prominent local business person might be a type of feature. So too, the story covering a trend like how many elementary school kids now use smartphones, or let's say all of a sudden we're seeing an uptick in men entering a career like teaching or nursing that had traditionally been for women, or vice versa, maybe women entering a career that had been typically gendered a different way. So on the next slide, there's a story from the New York Times about the decline in dating culture. You'll see there's no 5 W's here, rather the writer's exploring a trend. So if you look at the beginning of this right here, we start with this very clear example of one woman who has a bad date and she's just like, yuck, no. But then you see that down here, we get into what is the trend of. It says, instead of dinner and a movie, which seems as obsolete as a rotary phone, they rendezvous over phone, text, Facebook posts, instant messages, and other non-dates that are leaving a generation confused about how to land a boyfriend or girlfriend. And if you read the full story, you'll see that it keeps going back to individual daters, people that are having trouble navigating this world, to go back to this trend that we're looking at, which is, do people even date anymore? And then opinion or editorials. This is the one place where the journalist or a writer takes a clear stance on an issue. You will find them in an opinion section of a newspaper or news websites, and they include columns, editorial, short opinion pieces written by a group at a news organization that might define their stance on a topic, and news analysis, when the expert in a field, say someone who's in national security or media use, explains the impact of the story. In these cases, there's a clear argument, which means that the piece calls for some change on the part of the audience. This is why responsible publications will always have these separated and labeled clearly that they are coming in some form of opinion or editorial form. So here's another example from the Washington Post from 2013, where you can see, this is from the editorial board, which means it's a lot of people working together at the Washington Post, a combination of journalists and editors, who are making an argument. And here, what they're looking at is they've read a recent report and say, when we look at this, we are worried that we are not ready for this type of cyber war. And so you can see very clear argument right here. So if you want to read the full story, you can look at that and see how it differs from a hard news story where we do not have that opinion in. So we're not going to spend much time on the third type of story in this class. We're not going to be focusing on opinion writing because that is something that is a much smaller slice of journalism. Instead, we're going to be doing mostly hard news writing and feature writing. So both of these, we have to focus on the idea of objectivity. So objectivity is the principle which means the truth that's unmodified, the facts free from personal opinion or biases, and reporting that focuses on the interview subjects, the event being covered, and or the surroundings, not the journalist's feelings, personal conclusions, or preconceived notion of what a certain story could look like. So this is something that can be very hard to understand. Objectivity is something that has been fading more and more as we are all getting our news curated for us by algorithms on our social media feeds. And as more and more news publications are perhaps not labeling the difference between what is opinion and what is hard news. So here are the 10 basic principles put forth by the award-winning journalism school at the University of Missouri about what the journalist's role is today. It talks about what we do if we are trying to maintain this idea of objectivity, including the idea that we are independent from those people we cover. So for instance, you often see journalists are told that they are not allowed to display any political symbols. They cannot give political donations because any of that would suggest that they are then going to be more favorable to whoever they are personally interested in. But is objectivity even possible? This is something a lot of people point out. Humans are never fully free of biases. There's plenty of psychological research on that even subconsciously might be judging. And you might see a lot of I stories in journalism all the time. It's really common in journalism today. It's especially true on the online stories that we see. So why do we bother for objectivity? Well, fairness and accuracy are on the decline because of these easy platforms of self-publishing and increasing use of punditry, which means people that come and they talk and they give opinions. You might recognize this from cable news shows. Those who study journalism take the responsibility of trying to sort the fact from opinion. Trying, always aiming for objectivity, will help you develop the open-minded spirit essential to good journalists. You must be willing out to seek strangers with different opinions than yours or put yourself in unfamiliar situations. You need to be able to move the focus from your own opinions to what you observe. That's a vital practice if you're hoping to go into journalism. So here I've got ABC journalist Cynthia McFadden talking about this question, which is that can a journalist ever be objective?
I rarely am trying to tell anyone what to think, though I think it's just ludicrous for journalists to say, I don't have an opinion. We all have opinions. We're all dripping with opinion. The truth is, for someone in my position, is can I be fair? Can I be fair in what I'm saying? Which is quite different from, one of my favorite people in this business, Howard Stringer, who I never worked for, but when he was president of CBS News, he once said something to me that I think we should all remember, which is, Cynthia, beware the myth of even-handedness. What's that, I say? He says, you're going to do a profile of me. So you line up 5 people who love me and 5 people who hate me. You put all that garbage on the air and you say, that's the truth. Well, of course, that's not the truth. Maybe we should love him. Maybe we should hate him. Maybe it is something more complex than that. But, my job as a journalist is to try to sort out good information from bad information and present that, which doesn't mean I don't have an opinion. It does mean that I try to be fair in presenting the information that I am able to gather.
Another person who's got some opinions on objectivity is one of America's most storied journalists, Dan Rather, who also wants to talk about objectivity and the possibility of it and what exactly that means.
How do you stay objective in that situation as a journalist?
Well, I think it begins with the answer that no journalist can be totally objective, totally unbiased, every day, in every way, on every story. That the test of a journalist of integrity is over a reasonable length of time, how hard does he or she try to keep their own biases out, and how do they succeed? The critical point comes, and you've touched on it, when, as a journalist, you see something happening, you say to yourself, you know what, I'm a journalist, but I'm an American, I'm a citizen, I'm a father, I'm a brother. And this is outrageous. This is not compatible with my conscience. That's the test point of you're trying to stay objective and try to stay unbiased. But, you know, as a lifetime journalist, I can say, I can only speak for myself, you do the best you can, realizing you're going to make your mistakes. But sort of prizing those moments when you have said to yourself, you know, I've got to quit saying that I'm going to deal in false equivalency. It's one of the great dangers of journalism, false equivalency. Well, there's just as many voices on this side as there are on this. Giving airtime to mass shooters is something that journalists, for the length and breadth of...
So this clip will be available if you want to watch the whole thing. But I think that Rather is pointing out some important steps right there. This idea that you can never be fully free of bias, but that over the course of time, trying to make sure that you are giving that. And as both McFadden and Rather point out, that being objective does not mean giving everybody the exact same airtime, including things that might be, you know, saying that go against observable fact, things like that, does not mean that you have to publish that to be considered objective. Rather, your job, as McFadden said, is to separate that good information from that bad information. So, alongside objectivity is avoiding editorializing. It's a journalistic term which is used to note when a writer is placing their personal opinion into a story. In the work we do in English 121, we are going to be trying to avoid editorializing as we are working mostly in hard news and features writing. Not all editorializing, though, will be something that's like a clear first person, so they're saying, I think. I'm going to give an example from a former student's draft story where we can see some editorializing. It's more subtle. The key to achieving resolutions are in part stating a formal commitment and setting practical goals. However, it appears eliminating temptation is almost just as, if not more important. So we can see here that the journalist is presenting this information, these ideas, as if they are fact when it is really her opinion. However, if you look to the end, the reporter was offering this advice. Then what I told them to do is I said, why don't you go and ask some sources about this? And so the story that came back, he was showing some opinions right there. For example, freshman Bob Smith said he believes that stating a formal commitment and setting practical goals is necessary for success. However, for him, eliminating temptation is almost just as, if not more important. I think people need to both make the commitment and keep themselves away from trouble, Smith said. That's why I'm staying away from my friends who vape this month. So instead of presenting it as just, this is my opinion, this is my fact, he goes back to a source and says, here's what, you know, one of your fellow students is choosing to do for his New Year's resolution. Now, as you have read in, or will be reading, whether you've done it yet or not, in Chapter 5 of Writing for Strategic Communications, in general, you'll see that news stories are written using the inverted pyramid style, in which information is presented in the descending order of importance. So, from an editing perspective, this inverted pyramid style makes it easier to cut a story if necessary from the bottom. This really came from back in the day when most news was in print news and you really had to think about space. It's still used though today because it helps with regard to speed with reading. A lot of times in these hard-breaking news, you want to be thinking about how can I get the information out as importantly as possible to a reader who might only have 5 minutes while they're sucking down their coffee and they're scanning the front page. And so that's why you'll see that the who, what, where, when, why, how, those 5 W's and an H, will be in that lead, those first, as it said, 30 words potentially, and then we move in down to more crucial information and then anything extra at the very end. Here's an example of inverted pyramid as potentially one of the most famous stories you've ever seen. This evening at about 9:30 p.m. at Ford's Theater, the president, while sitting in his private box with Mrs. Lincoln, Mrs. Harris, and Major Rathburn, was shot by an assassin who suddenly entered the box and approached behind the president. The assassin leaped upon the stage, brandishing a large dagger or knife, and made his escape in the rear of the theater. The pistol ball entered the back of the president's head and penetrated nearly through the head. The wound is mortal. So what you have there is, of course, President Lincoln's assassination, and you can see that within those 2 paragraphs, we know everything that's happening, including that the president will die. So with a lead in an inverted period story, it's the beginning of a story. It's 1 to 3 short paragraphs and gives the reader the most essential information. You might sometimes see as you're reading lead spelled L-E-D-E, which is to distinguish it from lead as in the metal. Those spellings are fine. In the industry, older people might tend towards this version. So just in case you see all of those. So what does the lead offer? The who, what, where, when, why, how, and also so what and what's next. These last 2 questions are those that take into account your readership. Why does the story matter to them? Why should they care? And is there something they should be doing about this? So, deciding on how you structure a lead, you also want to think about your audience, the community, and the facts of your story. What's the most interesting part of what you reported? Let's take a typical event that would occur in this region. 2 cars crash on the Beltway near DC. Each has 1 person. 1 person walks away with just bruises and 1 is killed. What information are you going to put first if the person killed is important or well known? If the police believe the person who walked away was drunk? If there's recently been a recall on safety belts of the car the killed person was driving? If you were writing the story where the crash is still being cleaned up and all northbound lanes are closed and it's 4:45 p.m. on a weekday. So all of that is going to change what you're going to do. Obviously, if the person who is deceased is really well known in this area, that's probably going to be the very first thing. If it's something that relates to, oh my gosh, consumers need to know immediately that they better, if they have this car with these safety belts, they better get it fixed. Or, if you're writing the story right at the minute when people need to know that because of this crash, you better get out of the way, all that's going to change the lead that you're going to do. A summary lead concisely tells the reader the main idea of a story or conveys its news value. Sometimes reporters use this idea to describe one that's placed later in the article. So this might be one where you've got a feature or soft news stories that use this more dramatic storytelling technique where you might see the lead coming a little bit later. So right here, you can have the lead drops in from this particular quote, and then it takes us to this survey. Oh, my apologies for just jumping backwards. Once you've created the lead, give the reader more information in the body of your article. It's your opportunity to elaborate on what else you know about the story. Again, as a reminder, this all comes from chapter 5 of Writing for Strategic Communications. You can see that we've got direct and indirect quotes. When we go back to our lead, we've got our quote to start off. We've got here's what the main point is, that this sexual harassment is happening a lot. We bring in some quotes from important people, and you'll see that we are avoiding I, you, and me. We're using the third person right here. So as a reminder, these are the sources that I've taken this from. This is the one that is your assigned reading. This is a text that is always great if you want just a little bit more, but that is a totally optional one. I hope that this proved useful to you. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to your instructor, and feel free to watch this as many times as you need as you prepare for the module quiz.